Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. Invisible Man. By Ralph Ellison. Ralph Ellison's best-known work, Invisible Man, was published in 1952. After a successful publication, the book was awarded the 1953 National Book Award for Fiction. As a result, it has been included in Time magazine's list of the 100 best English-language novels of the 20th century and has earned the Modern Library ranking for the same title. African American literature, and 20th century American literature in general. At stake were problems of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and self-identification for the black community in the 1950s. The story's unnamed narrator tells us right away that he is Invisible Man, a member of a race that is inherently invisible. The fact that he is black and living in the United States means that he is frequently overlooked and treated like a child. When the narrator is 17, he is graduating from high school, and he begins his journey as a representative for the Brotherhood, a group that promotes the growth of black people. White people are shown to treat the narrator harshly and even harm him throughout the novel. Having been betrayed by the Brotherhood at the end of the novel, he now lives in a derelict basement, but he says he feels more free than ever before. The novel begins with a prologue in which the narrator describes himself as Invisible Man. His invisibility is not due to a superpower, but rather because he is a black man and people are averse to paying attention to him because of his race. According to the narrator, being invisible has both advantages and disadvantages. The narrator talks about his current situation. He takes electricity and hides in the basement of a building that only lets in white people. In preparation for something, he cranks up the volume on his Louis Armstrong jazz CDs. On one recent occasion, he was strolling through the park late at night when he was accidentally run over by a white man. The narrator reacted angrily to the white man's insults. The next day, the incident was categorized as a mugging, according to the police report. They believe this is interesting because, even though the white man was being attacked, he still had influence over it. The narrator would have been arrested right away if he'd phoned the cops. The narrator in the first chapter is a man in his 40s who is reminiscing about his past. The story he tells begins with him not yet realizing that he was invisible. He informs the reader that his great-grandparents were former slaves who believed they had gained equality with white people following the end of the American Civil War. For many years, my grandfather referred to African American life as a conflict and said that it made him feel guilty about belonging to my family. The narrator followed his counsel and tried to undercut white people by being pleasant. He's well aware that the white residents of his community think highly of him for his quiet demeanor. Narrators recalls being asked to speak at his high school graduation in front of the town's most prominent white residents. It turned out that the gathering was a battle royal in which the white males were forcing several of his male, black classmates to don boxing gloves and fight each other in a ring, in spite of his well-prepared speech on the advancement of black people in America. The young males were forced to fight fiercely by the white men, who blindfolded them. The narrator gets defeated in the final round. White males bring the pupils to a rug where gold coins, later discovered to be worthless painted brass, and crumpled dollar bills are strewn on the floor following a struggle. Upon reaching for them, the pupils are shocked when they discover that the carpet has been wired with an electric current. During the scuffle, the white guys try to make the lads fall face first onto the rug. Despite being given permission to speak, the narrator is interrupted by white men as he reads a passage from Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition Address. The narrator mistakenly refers to social duty as social equality. The white males are outraged and demand an explanation. He apologizes, saying he was mistaken. An unexpected gift awaits him after the lecture, a scholarship for an all-black state college. The briefcase was given to him as thanks for his time and thought-provoking speech. The narrator has a dream that night in which he is mocked mockingly by his grandfather. The narrator enrolls in a university and begins his first semester shortly thereafter. The narrator enrolls in college and begins his first semester soon after. He gets a job as a chauffeur for one of the affluent white college founders at the conclusion of his second year. While driving to the countryside for Mr. Norton, the narrator mistakenly ends up in the black side of town, where overworked sharecroppers dwell in rickety, once slave-owned structures. If the narrator mentions that one of the cabins is occupied by a man by the name of Jim Trueblood, Mr. Norton is even more intrigued by the scenario. The village has a terrible opinion of Jim Trueblood because he fathered a child while he was still a teenager. Mr. Norton asks Trueblood to meet him, and the man relates how he awoke from a weird dream to find that he was raping his daughter on the night he had an incestuous encounter with her. There are many white people who want to hear Trueblood's narrative, and they've given him money and support. Just to make sure, the narrator brings Norton to downtown's most infamous black bar to buy some whiskey to ease his anxiety. Norton confirms this by handing True Blood a $100 bill before leaving. While he's there, a prostitute approaches Norton and a gang of black veterans insult him. The veterans also chastise the narrator for serving as Norton's chauffeur and transporting him. When Norton gets nervous, the narrator takes him to a known black bar in downtown to grab some whiskey. While he's there, a prostitute approaches Norton and a gang of black veterans insult him. As if that weren't enough, the veterans accuse the narrator of being Norton's personal chauffeur and taking him around. The narrator has to drag Norton out of the way when a fight breaks out. As soon as Norton arrives back at the university, his narrator leaves him off at his dorm. In order to inform Dr. Bledsoe of what transpired, the narrator travels to find him after leaving him. When Dr. Bledsoe learns of the events of the previous night, he is enraged and chastises the narrator for taking the powerful white trustee to a hazardous part of town. Instructing the narrator to depart, Dr. Bledsoe tells him to go to church that night. It is only after service that Bledsoe will meet with the narrator in Norton's room, but it is only after the service that Bledsoe will meet with the narrator in Norton's room. On the day of the event, Norton says he emphasized to Bledsoe that the narrator was not to blame for the mishap. He offers to drive Norton to the train station and again apologizes. Norton respectfully declines, recalling their meeting with Bledsoe in the process. When Reverend Homer A. Barbee speaks about the founder of the college, a black man who was born into slavery and nearly died when his cousin sprayed him with lye as a toddler, the narrator attends the obligatory chapel service. He awoke from his 9-day coma believing that he had been raised from the dead. After learning to read and writing on his own and freeing himself from slavery, he headed north to further his education. She returned to Atlanta many years later and started the school. The message moved the narrator greatly. Barbee stumbles and drops his glasses as he returns to his chair after finishing the presentation. That's when the narrator discovers that Barbee is completely blind. Narrators visit with Bledsoe after the service, who is still enraged. He claims that white people offer ridiculous instructions like Norton's that day, and that the narrator should know how to bluff his way out of such situations after growing up in the South. The narrator must be punished, says Bledsoe. Rather, he informs him that he will be spending the summer in New York so that he can earn the tuition. It is implied from Bledsoe's words that the narrator will be recommended for a career after school, assuming they do well in this course. However, Bledsoe can hear his grandfather's last words as the narrator tells him to accept his punishment. To go out of town and meet up with one of the veterans who had humiliated Norton, he takes a bus to Manhattan. He learns that Dr. Bledsoe has ordered the man to be taken to a psychiatric clinic in Washington, D.C. This surprises the narrator, but not the veteran. His wink advises the storyteller to take a closer look at the details more regularly. Narrators are instructed not to reveal their true identities to white people or the invisible figure who is manipulating them. The narrator is surprised to find black police officers directing traffic in New York City. He notices a group of people in Harlem talking about chasing the whites out of the city. Fearing a disturbance, the narrator flees to a place called the Men's House, where he rents a room. As soon as Bledsoe arranged for him to meet the men, he now works for one of them. Letters written by Bledsoe were meant to be handed to these folks, but Mr. Emerson's son looks to be distressed after reading the letter. To his surprise, Bledsoe did not include a recommendation in his letter. Instead, he informed the men individually that the narrator had been expelled from college and was being sent away to protect the institution. Let him continue believing that he is working toward returning to school while keeping as far away from school as possible, says Bledsoe. According to the narrator's conversation with Emerson's son, his father is harsh and unforgiving, but his son will assist the narrator in finding work at the Liberty Paints factory. When the narrator leaves Emerson's office, he is furious and vows vengeance on Bledsoe. On the first day of work at Liberty Paints, Mr. Kimbrough explains him exactly what to do, despite the fact that he's still upset. The narrator's job is dripping a black chemical into buckets of a foul-smelling brown stuff. When he's done, he's supposed to mix the bucket of paint until it's a glossy white. When it comes to paint, Kimbrough claims that Liberty Paints' white is the purest and can cover up anything. A little further along in his story, the protagonist finds himself out of the black chemical and forced to return to the supply room for more. It's difficult for him to tell which tank contains which chemical when he finally gets there. The narrator, relying solely on his sense of smell, unintentionally selects the wrong ingredient, resulting in the destruction of some 75 buckets of paint. Angry, Kimbrough orders the narrator to assist the engineer in the furnace room instead. Brockway is wary of assigning the narrator to any duty because he does not like assistance. Finally, he tells him to keep an eye on the boiler's pressure gauges. The narrator returns to the locker room to retrieve his belongings at lunchtime and mistakenly enters a union meeting. Because he is Brockway's assistant, some of the other guys in the room suspect him of being a spy. He was sent away with his lunch and informed that the men had decided to look into the matter further. The narrator is threatened with death by Brockway, who becomes outraged when he learns about the meeting and that he is a member of the union. Even though the narrator denies it, Brockway bites him and loses his dentures in the process of their battle. Brockway hears the hissing of the boilers and remembers that they were not paying attention to them throughout the struggle. As the narrator is instructed, the boiler explodes due to the narrator's lack of attention. The explosion knocks the narrator unconscious. They wake up in a hospital and are unable to answer any of the doctor's queries, so they are taken to the ER. Doctors argue about whether or not to continue treatment with him while he begins receiving electroshock therapy. After receiving additional electroshock treatment, the narrator finds that he can't recall his name when asked by the doctors. In the end, he is released from the hospital and told by physicians that he has been cured. The narrator learns that the factory will pay him for an injury he sustained on the job. When the narrator is released from the hospital, he or she notices an enormous difference. He comes to terms with the fact that he no longer has any apprehensions about meeting someone like Norton or Bledsoe. The narrator collapses while traveling and is carried to the home of a kind black woman named Mary by a group of guys. A few hours later, after he's feeling better, Mary informs him that he should return if he's interested in renting a room. They return to the men's house, and the narrator is privately sneering at them. This has made him even more furious, to the point where, upon seeing someone he believes to be Dr. Bledsoe, he spews all over him before recognizing his error. An influential Baptist preacher in the area, he has a large following. The narrator barely escapes before being apprehended. When he discovers that he has been expelled from the men's house, he begs a porter to bring him his belongings from his chamber. The two of them share a room in Mary's residence. They begin to feel a bit of black wrath in the narrator and desire to become an activist for the black community. A few minutes later, the narrator spots a black family being evicted from their apartment and offers a passionate speech to the bystanders that inspires them to take action. To the dismay of the white landlord, the throng returns the possessions of the black family to their home. It was a masterful piece of persuasiveness when the narrator ran away from the cops, a white man tells him. An attempt is made to hire the narrator as a paid speaker for one of Harlem's political groups. The man, Brother Jack, accepts the narrator's rejection but provides him with a phone number to call if he changes his mind later. It's only a matter of time before the narrator changes his mind and phones Brother Jack, who arrives in a car with a group of men. While at a cocktail party, Jack introduces the narrator to his mistress Emma, who remarks that the narrator could stand to be a little blacker. When Jack begins talking about the Brotherhood, he refers to it as a social activity organization for black people who have been dispossessed of their heritage onto Booker T. Washington and what must be done before a global disaster occurs. This means that Brother Jack must relocate to a new apartment paid for by his new employer and cut all ties to his previous life in order for him to accept the post. In order to make good on his unpaid rent, Jack provides the narrator a new identity and $300. He pays off Mary's debt the following day and then leaves the house without warning her that he won't be returning. A Harlem gathering is scheduled for that night. He then calls Jack and asks him to speak. It is at the rally that the narrator gets so nervous on stage that he forgets all of the Brotherhood's catchphrases. The Brotherhood isn't satisfied with the speech he manages to put together on the fly. In their opinion, his inherent ability to communicate well necessitates a greater degree of their influence. The narrator studies the Brotherhood's rules and ideas for a long period. In the end, the Brotherhood chooses him to be their top spokesperson in Harlem. Finally, Todd Clifton, the executive committee's only black member, is presented and given an office to narrator. They are up against Raz the Exhorter, a black nationalist with a deep-seated hatred of all white people, Todd explains to the narrator. The narrator witnesses Clifton and Raz engaged in a ferocious duel at a protest against Raz soon after the battle broke out between his supporters and those of the Brotherhood. Since Clifton is one of the few black Brotherhood members, Raz inquires as to why he joins their ranks and assures him that his fellow Brotherhood members will eventually turn on him. The narrator establishes a name for himself in the neighborhood and puts in long hours to help the Brotherhood. But he continues to have nightmares about his granddad. This annoys another Brotherhood member who accuses him of trying to use the group to advance his own personal goals. During the investigation, the Brotherhood removes him from his position and sends him to serve as a spokeswoman for women's rights outside of Harlem. The narrator decides to devote all of his time and energy to this project. Soon after the investigation is finished, the Brotherhood informs him that he has been acquitted of the allegations. In addition, they tell him that Clifton has vanished. The Brotherhood has been losing adherents to Raz, while Raz has gained a following. Harlem residents have lost many of the employment promised by the Brotherhood, the narrator discovers. When the narrator returns to work one day and discovers that he has been excluded from a strategy conference, he storms out in a rage. In the middle of the street, Todd Clifton is selling dolls depicting racist stereotypes. This angers the narrator, too. Clifton gets into a fight with a police officer when officers show up to break up his demonstration. The police officer then shoots the victim to death, as per the command. The narrator returns to his office in a state of shock. Several distraught members of the Brotherhood approach him and inquire if Clifton has died. Asserts that it is and attempts to contact the corporate office in order to report this, but gets no response. Clifton's body is taken from the mortuary by the narrator, who prepares a funeral procession. An emotional address by the narrator is followed by a large crowd of Brotherhood members. There is a palpable tension in the room and he believes that the Brotherhood can harness it for the betterment of Harlem. For connecting their organization with Clifton's death protest, Brother Jack and the other officials of the Brotherhood call the narrator out. That the black community is against the Brotherhood at the present, he claims, was an attempt to justify himself. Eventually, one of Jack's eyes falls out of his head and onto the desk after they've been arguing for a while. Jack tells the narrator, in disbelief, that he lost an eye serving the Brotherhood. After this, Jack urges the narrator to talk to Brother Hambro about their new initiative, and the argument ends. Raz, now dubbing himself Raz the Destroyer, begins to lure more people to his side by denigrating the Brotherhood as the community's fury over Clifton's death reaches a crescendo. As Hambro tells the narrator, the Brotherhood is giving up its power in Harlem to focus on a larger national movement. To put an end to all this, the narrator plans to yes them to death in accordance with his grandfather's counsel. For this purpose, he planned to fill up bogus membership cards in order to fool the Brotherhood into believing that their Harlem membership has grown, and that the community supports this move. As riots erupt in Harlem, Raz serves as a catalyst for future unrest. The narrator dispatches Brotherhood men to calm the protesters and persuade them that Harlem would be cleaned up in the future. This riot is led by Raz, in the final chapter of the novel. Thus, the narrator concludes, the Brotherhood has been purposefully allowing Harlem to slip into anarchy in order to organize racial riots all along. In the middle of the riot, Raz spots the storyteller and orders the mob to lynch him. After barely escaping, the narrator is confronted by two police officers who only want to inspect what's in his briefcase and do not offer to assist him in any way. There's an open manhole in the narrator's path. The officers chuckle and replace the manhole cover, trapping him once more. The narrator is trapped below and must rely on the objects in his briefcase to provide him with light. In addition, he has his high school certificate and a piece of paper bearing his new name, both of which were given to him by Jack. All of the white males he has ever known have mocked him in his dreams. As soon as he can, he gets out of bed, screams, and resolves to hide out in the cellar. To sum up, the narrator says in the epilogue that the story's essential elements have been covered. I reluctantly accepted the idea that I'm an invisible man, he says. I'm an invisible man, and it placed or showed me the pit I was in. If his decision to quit society has put him behind in social activism or ahead of it, he leaves that question up to others like Jack. Living in a secret room in a basement that has been sealed off is the only way for him to maintain his anonymity. It's as though he starts to doubt the meaning of his grandpa's final words. If, in reality, his grandfather meant that he should accept the faults of society and work to overcome them, then he should do just that. On the train lately, he came face to face with Mr. Norton, an elderly white man. It appeared to Norton that the narrator was demented, and he did not recognize him at all. The narrator laments that the act of writing the book has not lessened his rage and questions why he agreed to do it in the first place. Announcing that even an unseen man is responsible for his actions, he ends his isolation. The narrator, the main character of the story. In spite of the fact that he is the narrator of the story, he does not reveal his identity. There's an aesthetic reason for keeping his name out of the story. It fits into the idea of his being the invisible one. He admits that if his race is irrelevant, then his name is also irrelevant. He sees himself as nothing more than a conduit for his story. They give the narrator multiple names throughout the story, but none of them are ever mentioned in the text. When it comes to narrating one's own personal development, the narrator's story serves as an excellent example of how this might be done. Narrow-minded and trusting, the narrator of the novel's first chapter is an innocent young guy who admires authority and believes the best in others. For example, he takes their scholarship with appreciation after being included in the fight royal in Chapter 1 and being physically abused at the demand of cruel white males. Readers are urged by Ellison to look beyond what the narrator is saying and create their own inferences in this way. He becomes a more sophisticated but bitter character later in the story, and he forms his invisible man theory. After rejecting society and living underground, he still retains a glimmer of his youthful energy, and hopes to return to civilization at some point in the future. Brother Jack, the head of the committee in the Brotherhood. After witnessing the narrator deliver a stirring speech in the street, Jack approaches him with the notion of having him serve as the Brotherhood's Harlem representative. For Ellison, Brother Jack is a metaphor for the false ideologies that obscure rather than solve the genuine problems facing the black community. According to Jack's portrayal, black people in the 1930s saw the Communist Party as partners who eventually turned on them and betrayed their cause. When Jack first meets the narrator, he appears to be a loving and generous person, but he is proven to be just like all of the other powerful white men in the book. Jack abandons the black neighborhood of Harlem without a second thought when the Brotherhood's ideas shift. For Jack, his glass eye represents his literal blindness as a result of his devotion to the Brotherhood's principles. Raz the Exhorter, a powerful man in the activist community in Harlem. In Raz's view, the best way to progress the advancement of African Americans is to distrust and punish the white population. An African American patriot, he exerts nearly godlike control over the book's unrest. Raz, despite his lack of planning skills, nonetheless exerts considerable influence over many of Harlem's activists. In the end, the Brotherhood allowed him to assume over so that they could move their attention elsewhere. The fact that Raz is able to achieve the control he desired by the book's finale does not change this truth. Mr. Norton, a white trustee of the college who has a negative experience in the black part of town while being escorted by the narrator. While Mr. Norton initially appears to be supportive of the narrator's cause and a potential ally, his true colors soon emerge. While on a brief excursion with the narrator, he acts like a zookeeper and demands to hear Jim Trueblood's rape story from the man himself. Afterward, Norton hands the man $100 as if he had just been entertained and paid for it. The narrator has to recover Norton when he faints in the bar because he is overwhelmed by the black crowd. Norton does not recognize the narrator when he sees him on a train years later and assumes he is insane. Todd Clifton, the youth leader in Harlem for the Brotherhood. The narrator's safety is Clifton's top priority, and he is incredibly loving and protective of her as a result. He suddenly vanishes and reappears after abandoning the Brotherhood and sells racist caricature figurines. He is confronted by police and shot by them for this. After his death, riots break out in Harlem. Pre-civil rights period American novelist Ralph Ellison was a prominent figure in African American literature. On March 1, 1913, Ellison was born in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Ellison, one of three brothers, had a difficult childhood as a black man in the early 1900s. He was a shoeshine boy, a busboy, and a hotel waiter while trying to make ends meet for his family. As a result, he worked as a shoeshine boy, a busboy, and a hotel waiter among other jobs to help support his family. The father of a friend gave him free saxophone and trumpet lessons when he was a kid since he acquired a passion for music. Booker T. Washington founded the prestigious Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where Ellison studied. When he was admitted to the school orchestra, he was recognized as the trumpet player. Booker T. Washington founded the prestigious Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where Ellison studied. He got accepted as the school orchestra's trumpet musician. As a librarian at a university in 1934, Ellison began reading classic literature. New York City was Ellison's new home after he dropped out of the university in 1936 and moved there. He moved to Harlem and became friends with Langston Hughes. When he first moved to Harlem, he met notable black novelist Langston Hughes, who introduced him to fellow black writer Richard Wright. When he wrote a book review for Wright, the man urged him to try his hand at writing, believing in his abilities. In 1933, a short story titled Jaime's Bull appeared in a magazine and became Ellison's first piece of published work. Ellison continued to publish book reviews and essays for the next few years. In 1933, A short story titled Jaime's Bull was published, marking Ellison's debut as a writer. Ellison continued to write book reviews and essays for magazines for the next few years. For the Communist Party, in addition to writing pro-communist propaganda, the author also published a few books. Ellison and Wright grew disillusioned with the Democratic Party during World War II, believing that it had switched its priorities and betrayed African Americans. Rosa Araminta Poindexter and Ellison were married in 1938. After Ellison had an affair with another woman, they broke up in 1943. His most renowned work, Invisible Man, was written while he served in the Merchant Marine during World War II. Fanny McConnell, his second wife, assisted him in editing the book. The novel was a hit, and the next year it received the U.S. National Book Award in Fiction. Ellison became a well-known author and lecturer, and he began traveling the world to give speeches and lectures. For his second novel, Juneteenth, Ellison wrote a collection of short stories called Shadow and Act in 1964. Yale University and Rutgers University hired him soon after he started teaching there. Ellison was never able to finish his final novel due to the fact that he lost much of the manuscript in a fire. On April 16, 1994, he succumbed to cancer and was buried in a crypt at the Manhattan's Trinity Church Cemetery. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.